Hello, everyone. Welcome to Shannon Q. We were almost late because we were so engaged in conversation with one another that I almost forgot that we should go on air. Because I'm the best at this. I'm really, really good. More people should want to talk to me, in fact, because I am so professional and good at YouTube. So, welcome everybody. I'm really excited that you're here today. We're going to be having a conversation about one of my all-time favorite topics. There's two topics I love to talk about the most, and those are the conceptualizations around the soul and morality. And today I have one of my favorite people to talk to just in real life in general. Prophet of ZOD is here. And you guys don't know, I'm fangirling a little bit, even though I talk to him pretty much every day. But you've never been on here to talk to me. You came on here to talk to SJ ages ago about morality. This is the first time
Yeah.
you're talking to me. So tell everybody who you are and where they can find you.
I am Prophet of ZOD. You can find me by typing that in on YouTube or I guess Twitter and stuff like that as well. Those are the two main places you'll find me, I guess. So just try, just try searching for me, seeing if you like watching me talk about stuff and send me messages, I guess, if you like.
Wow, it's quite the sell. Prophet of Zod is like my favorite channel. I love Prophet of Zod. It's one of the best channels. He's not gonna sell himself, so I'm gonna sell him for you guys. His channel is such, it's very insightful and succinct, and it's filled with really dry, like wit, like deadpan wit that you execute like no one else. Like no one has that delivery style. And you also have a wide variety of content. And I've been on your channel before. I played Eve in one of your cartoons, and I've read some stuff on your channel. So I've been on there too, which was like a huge privilege for me. So you guys should check him out. He's not going to sell himself. So I'm going to do it for you because you deserve to be sold because your channel is really, really good.
Well,
So
thank you.
just throwing that out there. Your sales pitch doesn't do you justice.
Oh, so I'm a terrible salesperson. I got you.
No, you're just a modest person, I think. I suffer from the same affliction actually. When it comes to my YouTube channel and like my social media platforms, I'm just like, I don't know, maybe you'll like it. I don't know, check it out. I'm really like
Yeah,
I'm bad
nobody
at
wants to
pitching
talk
myself.
themselves up. That just
Right.
sounds bad, right?
Yeah, it seems as though it's a bit ostentatious too, right? Like you just
So I just deliberately show up somewhere where someone like you will do it for me, and
right. Oh, so you're taking advantage of me. That's fair. Okay. Good to know. Good to know. I'll add that to the list of reasons that you and I are going to have a fight later. But today we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about morality and authoritarianism. And Zod sent me a video to watch before this, and it's one that you're going to be doing a video on soon, I think. And it was a J.
yeah,
Warner
it'll
Wallace
come out this
video.
week.
Oh, it's coming out this week?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. So watch out for it. His channel's linked in the description. So make sure you go subscribe so that you can see it when it comes out because it's going to be about this sort of subject matter. And I love talking about morality. So it's about morality and authoritarianism. And in this video, I'll just give you like a high level sort of description of what J. Warner Wallace was talking about. He was essentially saying, if I'm gleaning correctly just from my watching it this afternoon, that morality has to be a mandate because every sort of legal system that we have that gives us rules that we have to adhere to that we understand has been a mandate either from the police or the state or the country or the UN, and thus we could glean that moral systems are authoritarian, that they're something that's dawned upon us, they're regulations that are handed down, and that there's no other way to look at it. Like the buck has to stop somewhere. Would you say that that's kind of like a fair assessment of his position there, and
Yeah.
like the general sort of position that you and I come up against fucking all the time?
Yeah. The phrasing he uses is that morality has to be grounded in something. That's what he goes to. And that's, I think, where apologetics goes to a lot. And so he, there's kind of a mix of different truths here. And one of them is that when you organize a society, you need to have somebody telling other people what to do.
Hmm.
And when you have different levels of government, some of them will be higher in authority over others. And so there's this intuitive feel that that morality is being defined downhill.
Yeah, it's
Um,
hierarchical.
yeah. And so I talk about why that isn't the case, and we can dig into that some here.
Yeah.
But essentially, yeah, he says it has to be grounded in something, usually being a certain person or institution. And then he gives these circles that kind of go one above the other. And each of those is supposed to be mandating authority down to other levels. And so I don't know. It's hard to tell what morality is or where it comes from. And so what I think apologetics does in a nutshell, just to give the big picture of what we're up against,
Yeah.
is answers or ask the most childish question, which kids ask since they're in school, is like, who says or who's in charge? And I think they think that question needs to be answered before you understand anything about morality.
Right. And I find, maybe you find the same thing in a lot of these conversations. And I mentioned this to you when we were DMing earlier. A lot of it seems to come down to, like, if it's up to us, that's scary, right? Just imagine if I decided that we could just go kill everybody. Intuitively, you'd be like, ooh, I don't like that. I don't want people to just go kill everybody. And that means that it's scary. So the alternative is better. I'm going to present you an alternative where people, there's already a rule that says that we can't kill people. So that's a better alternative to being scared. So wouldn't you want that as a system, which is presenting authority, like authoritarian perspectives, as better because it's assuaging fear of harm? Like, that's a constant argument that drives me, because you're not really assessing why things are or are not moral. You're just saying you don't need to be afraid because somebody already made rules. So just adhere to all the rules unilaterally. That's dangerous.
Yeah. It's part of it is a fear, and then part of it is just a difficulty in understanding why we have a common morality and why we're not going to go flying off the rails because a few people think it's okay to murder people. It's a really complex mix of, I think, personal instincts and then a need for societal cohesion that we have.
Right.
And that's not suddenly going to disappear because someone says it's okay to murder, but that's hard enough to get your head around, that you feel like you want that security of somebody being in charge and telling you what the rules are.
Right.
And what J. Warner Wallace does very explicitly with his diagram of escalating circles is more or less what other people do on some intuitive level, which is, that your local government can't ultimately define those rules. So you bump it up to another level, and another level. And when you realize that no matter where you go, someone says my sound's gone. Am I?
Oh, no, I can still hear you. I think mine was really low.
Okay.
Is everybody? Oh, gosh, I hope not.
I just see a comment that says POZ sound gone.
Oh, no. I can still hear you. Let me know if you can hear us. It said my sound was low, so I turned my sound up, but Prophet of ZOD should still be there.
Okay.
All right. Sorry.
Well, yeah. I'll keep going.
Welcome to Shannon Q, the channel where technical issues regarding sound are essentially like the norm.
welcome to any show with OBS. But yeah, essentially, you know that no matter how many levels you go up, you're always going to run into the fact that that person can't just define morality, and there needs to be somebody else above them. And so I think saying that an infinite being, whether it's a god or whatever, is in charge of it all, I think that's the only way to resolve that in their minds. I don't know.
So I think it's because they hit a wall, and they don't. I don't want to ascribe more like motives to anybody,
right?
But I know it's difficult to grapple with the concept that, we don't know where this comes from, or it comes from us, and it's hard work to try to figure out what makes it important, why it's important, and what it is, grounded in. And it's significantly easier to follow intuitions. And so they appeal to like the bigger things, the things that people will all intuitively agree upon. So nobody's going to want to get killed. Nobody wants stuff taken from them. Nobody wants children harmed. Or the most people, the on measure people don't want those things. So they're easy things to appeal to. When you're saying, intuitively, obviously we all think this, it has to come from somewhere. Otherwise we all wouldn't have the same intuition. But that comes against a myriad of problems as well, because not everybody has those intuitions. That's not the entirety of morality. There's significantly more nuance. And if you're looking at a mandated system, just because it contains those as components doesn't give it efficacy. But when you appeal to them intuitively, then fear responses can kick in. And people will say, well, yeah, no, I don't want that. Other people don't want that. We have that thing in common. That common thing had to come from somewhere. It's hard work to try to explain where that may have come from. And there's a lot of nuanced, multifaceted things to examine in order to determine that. Or God, answer, solved, system, done. That's what it seems like to me. And I feel like that's a detriment, and which I think the authoritarian aspect comes in there, because if you're just saying, oh, okay, well, it was mandated to me, this is a prescription, then you're not doing all of the hard work of analyzing why. And then societies suffer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
I ramble. You're more articulate and succinct than I am.
Well, I think one of the telling things about it is we all have instincts, a combination of instincts and upbringing and acculturation that tells us, that informs what we think morally. And some of that stuff, like you said, will be more or less universal. We will not, on the whole, most societies will be full of people who do not want to murder children, or at least their own children, and people immediately within their sphere who they empathize with.
Yeah.
And then there are other more nuanced things that branch out from there that will be, result from your upbringing and stuff like that. And I think sometimes religious instruction, especially based on authoritarianism, and that opens a whole nother can of worms with this, is not only how you understand morality, but then how you teach it. When you teach morality from an authoritarian position, because you don't think about why you're training people. I think all that stuff adds up to a picture of what morality will be in your mind, and we all have some version of that. But one thing, I think Noel Plum said it, and I don't always agree with him with everything, but I think he had a good point, was that everybody thinks that morality should be subjective, but their idea of what the objective morality should be lines up with what they subjectively feel.
Right.
And so I think we all have these bodies of subjective feelings, and other people will have theirs as well. And how do you really resolve that and bring us together to a common unified understanding of how we coexist together? And I think one of them would be to label morality as objective and universal, but everybody's going to be labeling their own feelings about it that way. And then we're all going to be butting heads on a more blunt level, all of us labeling our own subjective feelings as objective, and basically going to battle with each other instead of digging to the bottom of why we think certain things are moral or not.
Right.
Beyond just being dictates or authoritarian declarations. What is it that makes something moral and immoral? And then at what point, on what things do we all need to agree to live together, and on what areas can we coexist just by living separately, I guess, or doing our own thing?
Yeah, that brings up it brings up a bunch of questions to me, and there's a lot of really solid points in there that I think that I would reflect on. Like, I feel as though everybody really, really wants a system to be solid. That they want to be able to say, okay, this is the one, guys, we need to adhere to this one. And very few people want to do the work of justifying why they can say that. So when you appeal to authoritarian principles, that takes away the hard work of justification. And some of those principles will have natural efficacy because there's going to be unilateral principles that are just intuitive because, we want to survive. We want to keep our stuff. We want to, without a lot of analysis. So there's things that are going to be universal that way. But your point about how you teach it is something that I haven't really thought about a lot. And that's interesting. Are you willing to explore that with me? Or I don't want to take you off of your track of authoritarianism, but I think that actually fits in there? Because I think there's a lot to explore there. Are you okay, like, exploring that with me?
Yeah, that's actually something I found most fascinating, and something I kind of had in
I haven't
mind
thought about it a lot.
when I was talking about this, was because I I ran a Christian school for a couple of years.
Yeah.
I grew up in a Christian school environment and in a Christian family, and I myself raised kids, at least consciously, I thought, from an authoritarian perspective,
Yeah.
that you train kids to do things because they're right, just because you're taught they're right. And not only that, but you value authoritarian responses from them. And I don't know how many watching this have raised their children in a fundamentalist environment like I did, at least at first. But you do value obedience just for the sake of obedience. There is this mindset that if your children are quiet, instantly compliant, and polite, and they immediately listen to you, whatever you say, that's a very valuable thing. And
and it's a reflection you did a good job too.
Yeah, there's a lot of pride.
Those are the optimal behavioral outcomes that people want to see.
Yeah, there's a lot of pride in it. They wouldn't call it pride.
Yeah.
But if your kids are the one at church being quiet and respectful and listening to adults, and they stop and turn on a dime and say yes, dad, or no, dad, or whatever, to whatever you say, that looks like Christian character to people. And there's something in that, some form of compliance that we all value from each other, that on the surface, there is something good about it, but in and of itself, it's not necessarily a good skill to teach, and it's not something good to value on its own, if that makes sense.
I feel like compliance in children is only good insofar as it protects them from harm. That's the way that I look at it as a parent. But I haven't thought about it from this perspective before, about the difference between prescriptive mandates. And I think there are a lot of analogs with parenting where, I work with my child because I want him, I've always said this, I don't want to teach him what to think, I want to teach him how to think. Whatever decisions he comes to will belong to him. But I also need to temper that with keeping him safe. And, that's analogous to society building in general, I think. And populations and controlling behavioral outcomes in populations. And when you look at prescriptive mandates when it comes to things like morality, you're coming to the right decision because you think you have to, because you're averse to punishment, for example, not because you understand that it is the right decision and why, and how it affects you and how it affects society. And those determinations don't even necessarily need to come into play to make what looks like a right decision. So your motivations for making the decision and your reason and analysis in what is a right decision can almost be non-existent, but you can seem as though you're compliant and be perceived as moral, even though you don't even understand why you're enacting those behaviors.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a big problem, is the mindset of the parent is just that you want to produce obedient children.
Right.
You want them to, even the phrase train up a child in the way they should go, and when they're older, not depart from it. You value obedience just because it's obedience. And I remember other parents around me, we'd be nervous about the idea that our children be disobeying or doing something behind our backs, because that needed to be stamped out. That was sinful behavior.
Yeah.
And you're thinking in terms of not only a certain outcome, but that behavior is a sin. You can't let sin be in your house. You can't let your children continue to sin. Rebellion, direct disobedience, deception. The school I grew up in, you would immediately be spanked for all of those things. In the school I worked at later, it was, at least on paper, immediate. A teacher tells you to do something, you don't do it. You heard the instruction and did not do it. You are immediately suspended, at least for one day.
Wow.
Because, and it was the same mentality between the two, except the one realized you can't really go around hitting kids anymore. But that hearing an instruction, hearing an instruction from an authority figure and then not following it, that's like one of the worst things you can do. And they would put it in terms of God is the covering over us. We provide the covering over the children.
Right.
We represent God's instructions to these children, because even though God's totally real, he doesn't show up and tell the kids things himself. So we need to mimic a naturalistic universe in which God doesn't exist by relaying his instructions to the kids.
I love you. This is why you're like one of my favorite people.
But I mean, really, that's what's going on. They don't think that consciously, but they are absolutely confident that God's never going to show up and say anything to anybody. So, and I remember feeling that burden. You are the voice of God to these children. Just as we need to obey God, they need to obey us. And to disobey a teacher or parent is to disobey God.
Mm-hmm.
And so because you're not thinking of morality as a tool to help a person function within society, you value that so heavily and get worked up. I remember if I thought one of my kids was doing something behind my back, you're just worked up that you need to do something about this. You cannot let that slide. You can't let direct disobedience slide. And it needs to be just, you're not thinking forward to what kind of person is this child going to grow up to be. It's all very rigid, where this is urgent in the moment, that they do not disobey, that they do not deceive. And that has an immediate urgency to it. But then you also think of this person on a steady track toward adulthood, where you're not trying to teach them to adapt to other scenarios that they're going to live in as an adult. You're trying to make sure they fit a rigid code,
right? That
to break it and keep deviating from it, they are on a path of sin away from God.
Yeah.
And so when you attach, consciously or not, the supernatural element to that their souls are being stained by these actions, that they are angering God, and that all these other things go into it, there's an immediate urgency about disobeying dictates without thinking what the actions are or what impact they have, and how you're training the child to adapt through your discipline, I guess.
You're giving them behavioral reinforcement that compliance is a virtue to be rewarded, and that disobedience, for whatever reason, will be met with swift and immediate punishment. That's a form of behavioral control. And it's dangerous, actually, because when you're taught that obedience is a virtue, especially unquestioning obedience, that, you don't question authority, there could conceivably and likely are going to be people in authority over you, that are wrong about something, that are leading you astray, that aren't making the appropriate decisions. And if you're taught that you can't question that, you're going to be rife for manipulation and potential abuse.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how is that not visible, though? Like, can you not, that seems apparent to me. Do I just see things from a different perspective? Because it just seems like you're teaching compliance behavior. If you say ostensibly that what you want is for people to honestly come to a faith and believe because they have a relationship with God, you don't train them in compliance. You train them in skeptical rationality so that they can come to these determinations on their own, of their own free will, and not be encumbered by fear of punishment as a motivation for holding a belief, implicit or otherwise. I don't know. Maybe I'm nuts. I just you would think that people, or maybe they do see it, and that's even freaking worse.
Yeah, they definitely don't want people thinking skeptically. Those are basically bywords within a fundamentalist community.
Why? See, I was never a fundamentalist. Why? Why is that? Why is it bad? Why is thinking skeptically bad? What message would you have delivered to you if you were a questioner?
So I think part of this is in any group of people outside a specifically skeptic community like ours, skepticism does, I think, have some kind of ugly, dirty feel to it. They almost akin to cynicism, where you're not trusting, you're cold and calculating. I think there's a language obstacle to overcome with that to begin with.
Okay.
And so I think it has a little bit of a dirty stepping outside the bounds feel to it to begin with. But then when you're dealing with a fundamentalist community, I mean, fundamentalism by its nature is not about asking questions and challenging the authority structure. It's about conforming to doctrine.
So it's a
at least,
submission structure.
Yeah, at least in theory, there really is no need for or even room for skeptically challenging why you do things, skeptically challenging anything. The whole premise is that you have a book with all the answers and all the instructions. And your job is to come to understand and then follow that book. And of course, that's polluted by the fact that nobody, I don't think, is really truly fundamentalist. Nobody truly believes it's completely the Bible. They usually make sure the Bible lines up with their own instructions and use it as a tool of coercing obedience out of people to whatever they want.
Yeah.
I don't think they consciously think that, but that's what happens. But the premise is that that the Bible has all that and you're supposed to follow it. So skepticism really undermines the entire point. And when you take that along with the fact, the whole I don't know, the whole phenomenon of sheltering kids, like a lot of Christian parents will not send their children to public schools necessarily, or they'll be very on guard against what they're learning there. We had this is loosened up some in some communities, but we had a whole culture that would really be opposed to sending children to public schools at all.
Yeah.
We made sure we were either in a Christian school or homeschooled to control what you're exposed to. And so really you start with the idea that you have a book with all the answers, and then you make sure that what people can hear and learn is limited so that they stick to what's in that book, that they're not going to hear other things or deviate from it. I think beneath the surface, there's a certain neurosis about the fact that things you yourself hear make you question your faith. You don't really want to acknowledge that, so you just shove it aside and pack it away and shelter yourself. How much more neurotic are you going to be about your children whose little minds you can't control?
Right.
Hearing something off in the world at school.
And people in the community around you too, you would want that to be a reinforcing place where you can go and hear other people that think like you tell you that you're right. Yeah. Affirmation, so like cultural and societal affirmations are incredibly strong motivations to keep beliefs and to not question beliefs or not continue down the road of questioning beliefs. Like, and that's true for everybody, I think, unilaterally.
And you even just want to be around similar people as well.
True, yeah.
Like when I went to college, one of the things that undermined my faith the most was not even a particular thing I learned, but that homosexuals, people in other religions, atheists, skeptical thinkers, these aren't the people that I was taught or that I would, by the implicit act of othering them, you get some understanding that they're evil or they're different, that they're fundamentally not necessarily less human, but you don't even think in terms of less human. You think in terms of less Christian,
right,
or something like that. That they are what you value as Christian or a good person or whatever is this baseline of things that's shared by all of them. And I don't think you want yourself or your children exposed to that as well. So I don't know if we've deviated from the whole why you don't value skepticism thing, but I think there is a whole phenomenon of trying to exclude certain answers or possibilities and keep you on the narrow path. That really is totally against skepticism from the start.
Interesting. So that all factors into when you're looking at authoritarian structures and assessments of morality. Like, to get us back on the original topic, I go down rabbit trails because whatever I think is interesting, I pursue it. Welcome to a conversation with me.
With you, so don't worry.
So, but it does factor into it, I think, because these are all modes And to some degree, they exist in all societies, in all cultures, in all structures. To, like you mentioned, othering, that you're going to look at other people as, fundamentally thinking different and acting different than you and approaching things differently and not understanding things the same way that you do, because you have your perspective and your perspective is the right perspective. That's just a way that people think. But when you couple that innate bias, and I think we should all acknowledge that we have these innate sort of biases because that's the best way to counter them. But when you couple that with a non-acknowledgement that it's even a bias at all, and then systems that are fundamentally geared towards behavioral control and on questioning compliance to authority, when you come to evaluating moral propositions, you aren't at that point even evaluating moral propositions. Like, so when somebody tells you, for example, I'm gay and that's okay, you're immediately going to have a bunch of mental triggers happen. You're going to understand that you were told that that is not okay and that you do not question authority, that the authority that you question could punish you, that there are sacrifices that you would have to make within a community if you even acknowledge that what that person said is worth considering. If you do consider it and come to an incorrect conclusion, what does that mean for the rest? Like, there's a cascading sequence of things that would happen in your mind if you even deign to question it, because you've been placed in a position where you're indoctrinated into thinking one way, and that only one way is acceptable for myriad reasons. So you're not evaluating that moral proposition. You're just taking it for granted and complying with the prescription that you were given. And that, to me, seems a dangerous way for societies to be constructed. I don't know.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah.
Like bad, like really bad, because you could literally just train up a group of people to believe almost anything is harmful and not okay. If you have that sort of infrastructure and pre-existing community built around it with effortlessly, and that's dangerous. Yeah.
I think the anti-LGBTQ thing is a classic example of this.
Yeah.
I think it's one that is most obvious and most clearly in the public eye right now.
Yeah.
There is simply no harm being done to anybody. There is nothing evidently immoral if we were to break down and look at disruptions to society or harm being done to another person. And so that's a really clear example of how modern evangelical Christians, who generally are going to shape their morality, even though they say they subscribe to the Bible, they're going to temper most things and shape their morality around basic modern ideals of human decency. Mm-hmm. They know somewhere deep down that there's something wrong with slavery or God telling people to go sack a city, mm-hmm. and that it has nothing to do with how they analyze the text of the Bible in Old and New Covenants. Something inside them would reach the right answer to that, regardless of how they analyze the Bible, and usually before they've analyzed the Bible. So in a lot of cases, they're driven by actual sense of decency. But homosexuality, I think, or whatever LGBTQ issue, even sex before marriage and things like that, those have somehow slipped through and continue to survive as pure dictates with absolutely no moral justification.
Right.
It's just the Bible says so. But even then, I think that doesn't sit well with most modern Christians, because when somebody, they aren't just going to say homosexuality is wrong because the Bible says so, or they will on some levels, mm-hmm. but they are going to have this instinct to jump in and start explaining after the fact why it's harmful in certain ways. Yeah.
A lot.
there's a reason why they say, for example, that they are going to be more suicidal, or that they're going to become child molesters,
or that the entire world population will cease to exist because everybody will just apparently pick being gay.
Yeah, because the actual act itself
Yeah.
does no harm.
Right.
And so they recognize they can't just harp on that by itself if they're going to be taken seriously in the public conversation.
Right.
But they wouldn't have arrived at these conclusions just by analyzing same-sex relationships or whatever it's going to be.
Right. They're
And
looking for
so
affirmation that they already have the right conclusion so that they can keep it.
absolutely.
Because then a house of cards might fall down.
Yeah, and one of my favorite examples of this was, I did a video about it, but Mike Winger's analysis of Steven Anderson's whole push the button thing, want to kill the homosexuals.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That was a very fascinating example to me of how somebody who wants to hold on to the theology of being against the LGBTQ community still wants to come to the right conclusion about not killing them. And his mind seemed to park somewhere in the opposing the act, which the Bible does. The Bible taught that, and he didn't want to let go of that. But the part of the Bible that goes so far as to say you should kill them, that didn't sit well with him. And so that's where you could see the wheels turning in his mind, I think. I don't think there's anything inherent in the Bible or any clear biblical teaching that would lead him to say that Steven Anderson was wrong. I think most of us know that Anderson is right according to the dictates of the Bible.
Yeah.
Or at least more right between the two of them.
He at least has the most literal interpretation.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you're going to say, what does the Bible say about homosexuals? What does it say you should do with them? What is it in God's character to want to do with them? Or was it in God's character at any particular time? Anderson has closer to the right answer.
Yeah.
But I think one of the dangers of this is with dictates is, and Wallace does this too, and we can talk about that for a moment as well.
Oh, I've watched. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But Wallace comes very close to the right answer a lot of times. I don't know if you remember in that video, and I can give an example here or two in a moment.
Yeah, go ahead.
But he really starts to shoot himself in the foot he talks right up to the edge of actual explanations of what morality is, then pulls himself back or gets distracted or whatever, and goes back toward dictates. And so I think that's what Winger does as well. There's really no biblical dictate about his middle ground where it's not okay, but you love the sinner, hate the sin, and you're not going to kill them. But he lands there in this weird mix of holding to his pre-existing biases, but his modern decent sensibilities will only let him take it so far.
Right.
And the problem is he arrives at the right answer, but it's not through introspection and thinking about why he's moral. He's letting that run in the background of his mind. It's a background process. And so it's guiding him, but in a haphazard way that's still vulnerable to his desire to follow dictates or his understanding that he should only follow dictates. And so Winger's case is a sad but fascinating one of someone who the right thing is happening somewhere in his mind, but it's extremely erratic, and he won't really acknowledge it and let it take him where it should.
Yeah, it's sad to be encumbered by a requirement to comply with heuristic scaffolding that you aren't even allowed to question. The best you can do is work really, really, really hard to interpret it so that it aligns with what your intuitions about what is moral and your understanding about how you should exist within the world and treat other people should be. Which is one of the reasons why it frustrates me when people point to the Bible and say, you know, this is where morals come from. Well, I mean, sure, if what you mean by this is where morals come from is a group of humans have read it and utilized it to interpret their intuition so that they could enact regulations, then yeah, you're just acknowledging that that's essentially what morality is humans using their intuitions about how societies need to be structured in order to best benefit all of us so that we can coexist without, you know, destroying each other and to the mutual benefit of all of us so that we can, you know, excel and avoid harm. then yeah, that like that's a tool that existed in that process and maybe played a great part. And you could even argue a really detrimental part for a lot of people, and still to this day for a lot of people. But just like any great work of literature or great work of art, you can find components within it that help to inform you how you would like to interpret reality, and can help to augment how you think and perceive things. Like any great work of literature, that's possible. But just the fact that it's possible doesn't mean that it's the source of those thought processes. It just means that it can be a tool that's utilized to inform them, just like any other tool could be. It just happens to be one that's more prevalent, and everybody tells you that you have to use it as a tool. And we've come to the point that I don't even think that's a requirement anymore, because we have access to so much information and access to each other that's unfettered now, that you could just you could erase the Bible from existence.
Yeah.
And we would be able to come to we would still be able to come to a lot of the same conclusions that we have already come to, and perhaps some better ones, because we wouldn't be encumbered by having the mandates that tell us that we have to treat certain groups of people as lesser or hamper them from existing to the full benefit of society and themselves and each other, simply because somebody arbitrarily mandated that who they are is unacceptable. And there's a million examples like that. So that's why I think the authoritarian models are they're trash, because it takes away that option, because you're appealing to something so archaic. I'll shut up. I monologue sometimes. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you're fine. I've done my share of it as well. I didn't mean to cut in on you or anything. Yeah, I would say the Bible is completely obsolete by now.
Yeah.
Except as a historical document.
Yeah.
Because people know enough morally coming to the Bible that they, at the instant they come to a passage, they know whether it's one that reflects the morality they already understand.
And how many people have really read it? Let's be honest.
Yeah.
Let's be real.
But when they come to a passage,
yeah,
they know whether that reflects the morality they already understand, and thus is an example of why the Bible is a good book. And really, if you can say the Bible is a good book because it says this, you've just admitted that the Bible doesn't inform your morality. You're using what you already understand about morality to judge the Bible.
Point. Yeah.
And
so you already have a standard that exists external of the Bible that you're using to assess it.
Yeah, and the fact that large parts of the Bible are not read, either because they're horrifying or because they're just mundane and pointless. A lot of Christians across history and then individually as they're reading have evaluated the Bible, decided which parts to read, and because of that, certain parts have ended up in Bible studies and memory verses and stuff like that, and other parts haven't. And so really, it's more of a reflection of what we already think. And as with Winger, it interferes with your process of understanding what you're already thinking. He went through a process of understanding this thing in the Bible sounds terrible. Steven Anderson saying it sounds terrible. He did the critical thinking thing,
and it
that
doesn't
we were talking
represent
about.
Me, nor do I want it to.
Yeah, so he did the critical thinking thing. He said, this does not add up to what I understand of moral behavior, because I understand moral behavior involves how you treat other people and living together in a cohesive society. His dictates took him so far as to still not think that this was not allowed, and to intrude on people's lives far enough to tell them that they should not love certain people, and to put a certain amount of social pressure on them for that. But what led him to not like the killing part was a critical thinking aspect applied to the Bible.
Right.
But he could not call it that. He couldn't say, I think critically about the Bible and I'm going to stop here with its teachings. He had to say that, well, this verse actually means that God doesn't want to kill them, and so on. I mean, we know the drill, basically.
Yeah. You made an interesting point there. So I always love talking to you, because you bring up things that make me think further about topics that interest me. Like why the passages that are selected to be taught most prevalently, there has to be a reason why those are selected and others are omitted. And that is an indication that you have a predetermined conclusion that's based on something outside of the Bible. Otherwise, you wouldn't be picking and choosing the ones that talk about love more so than the ones that talk about, stoning people in the streets for being raped. Like, or Jephthah, like, or the test for the unfaithful wife. Like, you would teach all of it and not try to interpret it through a lens of softness in order to make it
you wouldn't need
comport.
to, because every verse would land on your ears the same way.
What do you mean land on your ears the same way? Like, so if I talked about the test for the unfaithful wife and Jephthah, like, what do you mean land on your ears the same way when it comes to morality? I don't think I understand that.
Well, I mean, if the Bible is our instruction and we
Yeah.
don't have a filter we're bringing to it, a verse about beating your slave
Yeah.
or stoning someone for having been raped or whatever, that would sound equally comfortable and okay to you as Jesus talking about loving
That's
your
what
neighbor
I'm
and stuff.
saying. Yeah. Like, I think we're agreeing is that, like, it should, if you're being honest with yourself, sound equally as fine. Like, Jephthah killing his daughter should sound just as fine as Jesus washing somebody's feet. Like,
Yeah, you're absolutely making a good point. I was just saying there wouldn't even be that immediate moment's discomfort when you're reading the passage. It would all sound equal to you.
Yeah. So and this is one of the things that I struggled with during deconversion is that I had a hard time finding my version of morality in the pages when I actually like read them page for page. And I got to the test for the unfaithful wife and I was like, oh, okay, so God commits abortions, but I've been taught that that somebody who is raped shouldn't be allowed to have it, or a case of incest, or their life is potentially in danger, shouldn't be allowed to have an abortion. But a woman who may potentially want a baby in numbers, if somebody even suspects her of potentially being unfaithful, can have that pregnancy terminated by God against her, against her wishes. Like, it didn't. That's when I was just like, okay, none of this makes sense. I need to start assessing things based on, like, I need to start finding justifications for why I think things are and aren't moral that come from me. And then I came to the realization, oh, I already do. And that's why a lot of this wasn't great for me. Like, why I was uncomfortable, why I was dissonant, why I was attempting to find justifications so that it could comport with how I felt and how I understood my way to exist in the world. But yet, like, that's a point that I'd never thought of before. Like, why, if I was a real Christian and all of it came from God, all of that should, like you said, hit my ear the same. I should have read the test for the unfaithful wife, and that should have hit me just like Jesus feeding the hungry. Like, the loaves, that should have hit me like loaves and fishes. Those should have been almost identical experiences for me. I should have just understood the necessity of it. But you understand and feel emotional connections to people doing good things for somebody else when you see it as a good example. Like, you recognize that, and you don't, and you have a visceral reaction to shitty things.
Yeah.
But to have to justify them is so goddamn painful. Like, it must be hard to be a Christian, like, and keep it after you come to those realizations. Like, it has to be.
Yeah, I would say that I spent years as a somewhat liberal Christian. I think I identified with a lot of conservative points of view.
Mm-hmm.
But within my parenting style, within my understanding of theology, maybe the way I would approach people on certain issues, I think internally I had softened quite a bit. And I wanted to lean towards certain values of decency. I wanted to understand what I was really trying to raise my children to do.
Right.
But I couldn't quite let myself fully think through it and explicitly lay it out. And so once I quit believing and acknowledged to myself that I was an atheist, it was actually a period of time after then that I really conceptualized what I expected of other people, what I thought morality was, what I was training my children to do. And it has been a growing process. And I feel like I understand it a lot more. like with raising children, for example, there are a lot of things now that I fully understand that you need your children to be compliant for the sake of safety and instruction to some extent.
Right.
But you understand why that's necessary, and you understand to what extent it's necessary. And you don't have the same urgency about if you think they might have told a lie. You don't need to track it down because they've sinned and you need to cleanse them of it and get them back on the right path so that they're right with God and remove this supernatural stain that you think is on them that might send them to hell or whatever.
Jesus. Yeah. No.
Like they don't fully think through that, but that is operating somewhere in their mind.
Right.
And so it's hard to even fully articulate, but you have this understanding that you're trying to bring this person who is at a limited level of maturity right now to a place where they're going to operate as an adult in the adult world. And sometimes a child who acts in ways that seem a little bit defiant, that does need to be reined in so they can function well within your family and ultimately within the society. But you can see what's ever behind that defiance as a certain strong-willed nature that actually can have some value in the future.
Right. Yeah.
And that can be a strength for them. And so when you see a child that's like that, you don't see something that needs to be fully stamped out to the point that you're attacking something about that child's nature that is actually deeply a part of them and can be a strength. And you don't start going after your child in a way that's actually deeply personal and can be very hurtful to them and actually maladaptive in the long run.
Yeah.
And doesn't let them use their own strengths, put them in a position where they're actually adversarial toward you and trying to find out how much they have to obey, how much they can hide from you. And they carry that same dynamic to some extent into the future with their teachers and bosses.
And future relationships and their
children.
children.
Yeah, and relationships, yeah. So you don't really teach them how to adapt to whatever it is inside them that looks defiant. It's not totally desirable in every way, but no personality trait is totally desirable.
Well, I mean,
and so,
aside from me, but not everybody can achieve that. I'm a nightmare, actually, to be fair. That's, yeah.
But we're all nightmares in our way, and we're all valuable in our way.
Yeah.
And so tending to what's strong in your child and not attacking the core of who they are.
Yeah.
Instead of helping them tweak that and adapt it, you can do so much better a service to your child, and you can have a richer, more understanding relationship with them. You won't undermine that. I know a lot of the most strict, apparently holy families that appear very tight-knit. They'll sit around singing hymns and reading the King James Bible, whatever, not that specifically necessarily, but whatever signs of a good Christian family. And they end up with a lot of young adult children who wander away and everything falls apart because they're just trying to maintain this facade of compliance. And it doesn't really help them in the long run.
It would be awesome if God looked at his relationship with humans the same way that you just articulated a parent's relationship with a child. Really. Yeah. I don't think it's possible because I don't think God exists. And also, so it's not, but I would even if people saw it that way, but the thing is people can't see it that way because there's a book that they'd have to adhere to. And the book mandates that it's not even plausible for that to be the way a relationship exists. I just don't, it's frustrating to me because it's analogous too. The things that might be perceived as defiant in somebody who's a Christian that's questioning not even their faith, but questioning why a dictate is justifiable. Just if you were just allowed the freedom to throw out the archaic nonsense, it would be so much better. But you can't, because if everything falls apart once you do that, because if there's one chink in the armor, then there's another, and then there's another, and then you realize, oh, all of this is probably crap.
Yeah.
And I don't need to adhere to it. Like, I try to find ways in my head that as a Christian or as, you know, a member of any authoritarian based religion that has a moral sort of constitution that's mandated, like, how do you comport? Like, Islam's a good example too. Like, how do you comport societal existence and real assessments of what morality is, why it exists, how to enact it, how we evaluate moral propositions? How does it reasonably comport without just ignoring whole cloth portions of the scriptures of any given religion? Like, I don't think it's plausible. I don't think it's possible. I don't think it can happen. Not if you take it in any way as prescriptive. Because once you realize that and it's open to interpretation and you start really formulating these analyses, you realize not only do your conclusions not comport to what's held within the pages, you realize they're better, likely, and also that the pages weren't necessary to begin with because you're capable of coming to your own goddamn conclusions.
Yeah. And you're doing it anyway, whether you think about it or not.
Yeah, exactly. Whether you're aware of it. And I know I'm supposed to take questions. We'll take questions in a second. At me in the questions. At me, and I'll ask Zod questions. I'm being a bad host. I'm looking at the chat now. I promise. Sorry, Zod. Go ahead. You had a thing to say. I'm just.
And I was going to say one approach that they've taken to that, and I probably have about 20 minutes or so, if that's okay.
Okay, yeah,
so I don't
that's
know
totally
when
fine.
you need to. Yeah, I don't even know when you need to start getting to questions in light of that. But one thing they do that I started hearing Christian education do in recent years before I left the faith was start to define certain things as heart issues and other things as not heart issues.
What does that mean? Oh, I don't understand that. What does that mean? That's news to me.
So if you're
tell me what that means.
It shows a certain awareness of maybe psychology or the level of childhood development.
Okay.
And if a kid's a little bouncy because they're just full of energy, that's not a heart issue. But if you tell a kid to do something and they say no and storm out of the room, that's what they would call a heart issue. It's an actual willful stand of disobedience, or sin, I guess would be another way of saying it.
Okay.
So in theory, they would see everything a person does as an affront to God or not, right? Or as a sin or not.
Right.
But they try to let in a certain amount of understanding that certain things aren't necessarily sins, or they call it a heart issue because it's not you willfully choosing to sin. Your heart is not bad when you're doing it. You're just acting based on a certain amount of instinct, whether you're a little antsy or having trouble paying attention or something like that.
Right.
Or if a child has a developmental disability, if a child has autism or maybe ADD, depending on how liberal the Christian is,
right,
in their view of that stuff, that person is not acting out of a heart issue; they're acting out of a developmental brain issue.
That seems so arbitrary to me, though. Like, you could, like, yeah, just an arbitrary distinction that, like, these are behavior outcomes that I don't like. They're heart issues. Everything else I can find a justification for, and doesn't involve you not conforming or comporting to mandated instructions.
What it fails to see is that everything is a brain issue, really.
Well, yeah. Well,
everything's a product of our brains, and there's levels of what you might call dysfunction and stuff.
They would never acknowledge that.
Oh, I know, but that's that's the truth they're starting to acknowledge.
Yeah.
And so it's weird how they arrive at a certain amount of this, but still continue.
They scratch at the surface
mindset.
Of right.
Yeah.
Like, it scratches at the surface of right, but stops just short of actually acknowledging something that might be dangerous. That's one of the reasons I like morality and the soul as conversations for people to listen to. Because with the soul, you have to come to the realization that it's a component of your brain, especially if you're going to be somebody who realizes that mental, psychiatric disorders are a thing that exists. Then you have to acknowledge, like, there's a body of science that tells you that your brain helps configure who you are. The same thing with morality. When you realize that you're making moral assessments and that you are providing justifications for them, and that you don't require the Bible to make those justifications, that starts a string of epiphanies that bring you to realizations. And that's why I think they're important conversations. Oh, Paulogia has a question. Would ZOD agree that heart issues are basically rebellion?
Yeah, I think Paul comes from a similar culture as I did.
Yeah.
And I think we have a lot in common as far as our history with the faith.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I would say that a heart issue is essentially rebellion. That's what they would, that's where if you, within this disciplinary framework, you would be suspended for what they called a heart issue if it was very deliberate and open. Whereas a developmental issue, you might be let off the hook a little bit.
Yeah.
But so yeah, I would say that's pretty close to precisely what they mean, even if they don't always say it that way.
Yeah, but that doesn't acknowledge that you could have a psychiatric disorder or a mental health disorder that leads you towards rebellious behavior. Like you could have some sort of abusive like you could have a background where you suffered abuse, or you have PTSD, or you have an impulse control issue due to a traumatic brain injury, for example. All of those things are things that can lead you to what you would label as rebellious behavior. So if they can see that for something that, you know, is overtly commonly understood, which it seems like is the conflation to me, is that it's commonly understood that something like autism exists. It's commonly understood. So they can't deny that. But the effects of neurochemistry and neuroanatomy, just generally, you're able to just whitewash over that and not understand the nuances of it, or even attempt to understand the nuances of it, because you can just label that as a heart issue, ignoring the fact that you're acknowledging simultaneously that behaviors are manifest from neuroanatomy.
Yeah. And this is repetitive, but to keep making the connection, because I think a lot of these things are very, very connected in the mindset behind them. Mm-hmm. Just as Winger wanted to hold on to enough of his theology, regardless of how ignorant, he had to let go of it at a point it became horrifying. Mm-hmm. And just as they want to hold on to their understanding of behaviors as sin or heart issues or rebellion, there's a certain point they have to let go of it because it becomes so obviously ignorant of clear facts. And I think they try to muddy the two. Like you brought up other things like abuse and stuff.
Yeah.
All these things feed into what kind of person we are and how we respond to other people.
Right.
Someone who seems defiant might just be scared and on guard, and they have some defense mechanism that puts up blocks against authority figures and makes them want to shut them out and has them be on guard because maybe an authority figure has misused them at some point in the past. Mm-hmm. That child is not just being defiant as a heart issue. And so once that person's personal history or brain chemistry or whatever defines their actions, where do you draw the line where other people's do not? And I think they muddy this on purpose. I think even C.S. Lewis wrote something about this. I'm embarrassed to say that I had read, a lot of his stuff back in the day.
I wouldn't be embarrassed.
But I remember him saying something about the contrast between if I'm paraphrasing, so I might not be totally right, the raw materials that we're built out of and then what we choose to do with them. And I think that's a lot of the thinking that they're getting at here, is that we're all made out of certain raw materials. We have a history, we have a chemistry, we might have disorders, and those kind of impact what we tend to do. But then where we sin or don't sin, or have heart issues or don't have heart issues, is ultimately whatever choices we tend to make out of that. And there's really no way to make a distinction. And I think that's where they skate out of it by saying we can't judge, that's up to God. But really they're covering the fact that they're talking about one phenomena and trying to parse them out into two different things.
Yeah, I think they're relying on generalized perceptions and understanding of how neuroanatomy functions, like how cognition functions, because most people can accept that autism spectrum disorder, is something that's in reality, but they just look at that as something being wrong with the mechanism by which the soul communicates with the body, because that's what they see the brain as. They see it as the conduit through which the soul communicates with the body, and that that's damage in the conduit in their perspective. Not what I think, by the way, when it comes to autism spectrum disorder. Autism people, oh my gosh, I love people on the autism spectrum are actually some of the most amazingly wonderful people to even have discussions with about anything, and they're the most misperceived, and they're seen as, I could go on about that for ages, and it's not the point of this discussion, but anyway, sorry, but like, they see it as damage to the conduit. So because they see it as damage to the conduit, they're still allowed in their minds to see the soul as separate from the brain, because they don't see the brain as what runs the body. They see it as the mechanism through which the soul communicates to the body, because they don't understand. Most people just don't understand practically anything about brains. More people should learn about brains. Go learn about brains. That's what everybody should take from this.
Well, this is really a phenomenon. This is really a phenomenon of the mind being one of the last things I think we fully understand.
It's true.
We can understand that God does not exist in lightning or the sun or whatever.
Yeah.
And so that's why he moved into the mind, because that's one of the most difficult things for us to still understand.
Yeah, but we're understanding more and more.
I have a hard stop in about 9 minutes or so.
Oh, okay.
So I don't want to stop too abruptly. So if there's anything you want to do by way of wrapping up, whether it's answering questions or whatever else.
I'll one question. I'll take out one question. This question's from in. Even without the Bible, people have moral intuition. Do you think that people can be ethical without a feeling of empathy? Yes. I think they can act ethically. Of course they can, because I think you can come to rational reasons why you should behave morally.
Yeah. And that boils down to a really big question of what does it really mean to do good or be good?
Mm-hmm.
And that gets into the whole thing of what heart issues are and stuff like that too. Even when I was a Christian, even as a child, I struggled with the question of when is somebody actually just intending to be good? We're all doing something to get a reaction.
Mm-hmm.
Everything we do, good behavior gets us a reaction out of the rest of society. It can be if it's based on empathy, it's a good feeling within ourselves based on our understanding of wanting something good to happen to the other person. If we lack empathy to various degrees, it can be because of the response we want to other people or from other people. Even when you're a Christian, I started thinking down that path and realizing I was behaving a certain way because I wanted a response out of God.
Right. Yeah.
And so when are you really being good versus acting out of a desire for a series of exchanges with other people? And so, I think that question is hard, because can you be ethical? What does it really mean to be ethical? And I think the best way to approach it is, like you said, the person can produce ethical behavior. Yeah. For whatever reason, they conceptualize it inside themselves.
Yeah, because you can't ever know somebody else's motivations. Somebody could be an absolute psychopath mentally. Like, they could mentally be a psychopath, but they could have come to the rationalization that in order to best benefit myself in society, I have to follow a certain set of behavioral standards that are going to result in an outcome that's most beneficial to me. And that means that I'm going to have to act as though I give a shit about people in order to have them reciprocate that behavior towards me, so that I can get the benefits of people, enjoying my presence. And I realize that if I do something for someone, there's a chance that there's going to be reciprocity down the road. Like, these are all things that somebody can rationally come to. But I think we intuitively want to believe that morality exists because we want to do good things, and that the people that don't want to do good things are immoral. And maybe innately they could be by our standard of what morality is, but really what's important about morality is that we create ethical systems that manifest the best behavioral outcomes for all of us, which is all the more reason that we should figure out why they're rational, provide justifications, and be able to explain them. And you can't just do that with prescriptive mandates that have no backing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that kind of solves the question of what's raw material versus what's intention, because I think one of the big problems of theistic morality is that you're trying to assess ultimately how good a person is.
Right.
By whatever thing, whether it's grace or works or whatever, does this person deserve to be in heaven? Does this person deserve to be in hell? Do they deserve any kind of comeuppance or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of really understanding what morality is and what we expect of people is recognizing that we're not ultimately going to evaluate what kind of a person somebody is. We just want to get them to the place where they're going to function well in society.
Right.
And for some people, that will be more difficult. I can understand excusable reasons why somebody might have a more difficult time of that, whether it's a history of abuse or disorder or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But you try to find them within reasonable expectations, try to find the way to help them fit into society the best they can. And once you can understand that's the goal, whether it's through parenting or your expectations of those around you in the workplace or whatever field you're in, that really provides clarity of what you're really going for, what you expect from other people, and that the outcome is not to measure, weigh, and then punish or reward people in the end. It's just to help us all participate in a society in a way that's most humane to them, but then also benefits people, at least to the extent that they can function well.
Yeah.
And so we have to, whether or not that expectation is fair, we have to have it, or else things just won't work. And so I think that kind of untangles the whole heart issue versus raw materials thing, or it kind of makes the whole sin versus not sin or dictates thing pretty irrelevant, I guess.
And I think more people should ask themselves the honest question. The way that we described it versus the prescriptive version that religion gives you, which do you actually think, when you assess the principles, is likely to come to the best outcome for everybody?
Yeah.
And honestly answer that for yourself. So I'm not going to hold you anymore because I know you have a hard stop. I would like to first acknowledge that Unholy Sarah and D-Style Boxing both send super chats. Sarah sent me a heart and D-Style Boxing just sent nothing. So I don't have anything to read but other than your names. So thank you for that. I very much appreciate it. I appreciate you guys coming for this conversation, and I loved it. This was an awesome conversation. I hope that you enjoyed it as well, Zod. Thank you for being
Well, yeah, it was a
here.
ton of fun. I really enjoed it. So we'll have to do it
Good. I'm so
sometime.
glad. Yay. Maybe you'll come back and talk to me again sometime, or I'll find somebody else for you to fight with. Because that was fun too. Watching you talk to SJ about morality was fun. Maybe I'll link that in the description, or I'll put a card or whatever.
That was a very different experience. I will tell you that.
Oh my gosh, you doing the shots as you're It was the old version of my template, so like it wasn't as nice as this one is, but so I'm in the corner just like muted but dying every time you took a shot. Like you can see me just like covering my face. Oh, it was amazing. But
that's one scenario where you don't necessarily need all your faculties about you. And
oh my god, that was one of my favorite things. The first shot you took, I was like, he didn't just take a shot, and then he took another. I was like, oh shit, he lined them up. Oh my god, he was ready.
Anyway. You gotta get through an hour and a half with SJ one way or the other. So right.
Oh my god, you killed me. All right. So thank you, everybody. Like and subscribe and do the things that YouTube tells me I'm supposed to tell you to do. I'm going to put up an end screen now, and this is how professional I am. Now I have to just talk for 20. Would you have anything to say for my end screen, Zod? Feel free to say it because it's an end screen.
I'm not nearly that professional either, unless I'm fully scripted, and even then it's questionable. So just go ahead and do your thing.
We're a great team. Click on whatever links you see here, I guess. Hopefully I'll remember to put them up. Bye, guys.
Bye. Thank you.